Alright guys, we are back in my garage for another video, and today we are going to be upgrading the turbo in my 340i. If you guys saw my previous videos, then you'll know I've gone with a dynamic AutoWorks turbo, but this isn't just the normal off-the-shelf turbos that have been sold in the past. This is a new design that is going to be higher flowing and give you better spool and more horsepower capacity. So I'm really excited to put this on my car. If you guys have seen, again, my whole channel has documented my build on my 340i, so I've got a lot of supporting mods, and this was kind of the final piece of the puzzle, and I'm excited to use it this year as I daily drive my car and track my car and really push this turbo through its paces. So in the future, of course, I'll be showing you guys how I get my car dialed in and what the results look like, but in this video specifically, I'm just going to show you how to install it on your B58 engine, so hopefully you guys find this video useful.
Now, as always, for everybody that's new to the channel, I create these videos to help keep you updated on the latest developments in our community, as well as discuss technical topics so that we have a better understanding of how our engines work. So if you're interested in more videos like that, be sure to subscribe because there will be a lot more coming out in the future.
Hey you, don't be a silly goose. This job requires disconnecting electrical connectors, so that means that it's a good idea to disconnect the negative terminal on your battery. This will make sure that you minimize the chance of causing electrical issues while you're in the process of doing this DIY. So pop open your trunk, open up the battery access panel, and grab a 10mm socket to loosen the negative terminal on your battery. I also highly recommend putting a microfiber towel on top of the battery so that you don't inadvertently complete the circuit while you're in the middle of the job. And it's a good idea to put a microfiber towel through the trunk latch so that you can avoid closing the trunk by mistake. Alright, now let's go ahead and get back to the DIY. Alright, so we've got the car pretty much staged and did the first couple steps. I got those out of the way. If you guys have done pretty much any DIY on our cars, then you know kind of how this works. But if you come up to the car, we're basically just going to remove all of the upper trim and everything back here, the strut brace, all that jazz. And then the car is jacked up, so underneath we removed the under tray and everything so that we can drain the oil and the coolant and things like that. So just kind of get your car to this point. If you've done pretty much any DIY on this car, you know this is the first step for almost everything. And now let's go ahead and jump into the turbo specific stuff. So the first step is to remove the intake. I have the Race Ready Performance intake, so my removal might be slightly different than yours if you have a stock intake box. But basically, you just need to remove the upper and lower intake box. Then unplug the MAF sensor from the intake pipe, and then below that you should see a hose clamp that needs to be loosened. So back off that screw, and then you can pull the whole intake pipe out of the way. In my case, I have a separate heat shield as well, so I need to remove these two mounting screws, and then I can remove the heat shield. Next, we're going to remove the turbo inlet. There are some wires in the way, so we're going to unplug those from the wastegate as well as the PCV heater. Unplug those, and then you should be able to move that wiring harness out of your way so you can access this clip that's holding the turbo inlet in place. You can use a long pick tool or a flathead screwdriver and just reach down to pull the clamp off. You're going to need to pull it up from the turbo in order to unclip it, and then there should be an evap hose on the side of the inlet that also needs to be disconnected. Just squeeze in on the rough sections on the side, and then it should pull off. I deleted my evap, so it's not there, but if you have it on yours, then yeah, it needs to be unplugged. Then you can just pull the turbo inlet off of the turbo. Next, we have the same style clip on the charge pipe, but this one's a little more annoying. If you have the stock charge pipe, there are like these black plastic pieces over it, so it's harder to access, but it pulls towards the engine, so you kind of need to push it forward in order to release the clamp. So do whatever works for you. In my case, I just completely pull the clip off of the charge pipe, and that makes it easier. And then grab a flathead screwdriver to pry it out of the way. Then on the opposite end of the charge pipe, it's held in by 3 screws onto the throttle body. Use a T30 to remove those screws. And then you can also unplug the pressure sensor and the temp sensor from the charge pipe. And then at that point, the charge pipe can be removed completely. Now, of course, the last bolt-on you need to remove is on your downpipe. The first thing is to remove the V-band clamp holding it onto the turbo, and you should be able to see the bolt holding the clamp on just underneath the turbo. So use a deep 1/2-inch socket to loosen that, and then remove the V-band clamp. Then when you get under the car, we're going to remove the exhaust from the downpipe. So there's just one nut holding the clamp on, and then there's also a nut holding the midpipe onto the exhaust hanger on your transmission. Mine is loose enough where I can just wiggle out the downpipe from the midpipe, but if yours isn't this loose, then you may also need to drop the muffler in the back of the car and pull the whole cap back off of the downpipe. Then you've got these two nuts holding the downpipe onto its mount. They look like they're really far away, but it's actually pretty easy to access from the top. So just reach in with your socket wrench and remove both of them. Now it's time to remove the oil and coolant lines. There's a small torque screw holding them on, so you'll need to remove those screws first. Then I'll admit these lines are held in pretty good. So just take your time, wiggle them back and forth, and pull on them until they come out. I don't necessarily recommend using a screwdriver to pry them out because you can bend the flange, but some people have been able to do that if you're just really careful. Then the last coolant line at the back is simply clamped onto this hose under the manifold, so you'll need some pliers to squeeze on the clamp and slide it back, and then the hard line can actually be pulled out. And here's what it looks like with all the lines removed. So you can see I've slid the hose clamp back and the hose is off of the hard line for this coolant line. And then also for the oil drain under the turbo and both the coolant lines towards the front of the engine, everything is removed. You may just see a little bit of coolant dropping out, so just be ready, put a bucket under the car to catch any of the drips that you see. Now we're going to remove the 7 nuts that are holding the turbo onto the cylinder head. You can see there's basically one between each of the runners as you work your way across. Then underneath the turbo, there's this support bracket. I only removed the one Torx bolt going through the bottom of the turbo since it's easier to access, but you can also remove the 2 additional bolts holding the bracket onto the block. These are sometimes easier to remove without the turbo in the way, so feel free to wait like I did. Then at this point, the turbo should be completely loose. So you want to basically pull it out. It's just wedged into this mounting bracket on the bottom of the manifold. So lean it back, pull it up. Then you should be able to pull it out at an angle towards the front of the car like you see here. And just watch all the oil and coolant lines to make sure they aren't snagging on anything.
So a lot of people ask me about buying an installation kit for their turbo, and a lot of people sell them, but it's actually pretty easy just to buy all the parts individually. So I'll put all the part numbers in the description, and you can buy it from a dealership. I get mine from FCP, so whatever works for you. But basically I get the gasket for the actual turbo manifold to the cylinder head. I get a bunch of O-rings for the oil and coolant lines. I get a replacement downpipe gasket, and then I also get these brass nuts. These are the nuts that hold the turbo in place, and I don't always replace them, but usually after I've had the turbo off a couple times, I typically recommend it because they're pretty soft and they have these crush washers that, get crushed down when you tighten them. And one thing I noticed, I don't know if these were replaced at some point, but the nuts on my turbo don't have the washer. So I don't know if that's something that early B58s had, or if, like I said, they were just replaced with something else by the previous owner, but I went ahead and bought some new ones to make sure I can hit the torque right and avoid any exhaust leaks. All right, so there are a couple things that we need to swap over, mainly the wastegate as well as all the oil and coolant lines. So those will be transferred over to the new turbo. So starting off, we'll get these 4 screws off of the wastegate. They are all T20s. Then here on top, we're going to remove this C-clip that's holding the wastegate arm onto the turbo. So just get a small screwdriver and try to wedge that off. Make sure you have a finger or something there because it will try to go flying. Here we go. And then we can lift it and pull it all in one piece. Now, as long as you don't adjust this, I basically recommend leaving this as is. If you weren't having issues before, you shouldn't have issues after. So just keep this on, don't loosen this nut, and you shouldn't have to recalibrate anything when you swap it to the new turbo. And then of course we have the oil and coolant line. So it's basically a bunch of T30 screws. Remove all of those and then remove the lines. Sometimes these can be a little bit tricky, so just take your time with it. They are stacked on each other, so you need to remove them in order. Pull on the top one first, and then pull on the bottom one.
don't necessarily recommend using a screwdriver to pry them out because you can bend the flange.
And then the last one is on this side. Again, same thing, T30 screw, and then remove the oil line. All right, and we'll just go throw this away. And here we have the new Flowmax. So this is the new Flowmax, and I talked about this in my video where I discussed why I'm upgrading my turbo, but this is the new version of the Dynamic AutoWorks turbos for the B58. By the time I post this, I'm not sure if it'll be fully released or announced, but just the information that I can give you guys now, this has a much bigger exhaust housing. So a lot of people have apprehensions with hybrid turbos because typically what they do is reuse the stock manifold and the stock turbo, just kind of bore it out to fit a bigger turbo wheel inside of it, maybe a slightly bigger compressor housing, and that allows it to flow more air, but it gets choked up here. And so by going with a bigger exhaust housing, bigger ports, bigger runners on the manifold, everything will be higher flowing. So that will allow it to spool more quickly as well as support more top end power. So this is pretty cool. This is going to be the smaller version. Dynamic AutoWorks will also be releasing larger versions, but because I'm sticking with the stock transmission, stock engine, and stuff like that, I think this will be plenty for my needs, and it will have the quickest spool, which I want to be able to take advantage of when I get back on the road course this summer. So let's go ahead and swap our parts over. So down here, we're going to put on our oil drain, and every single line, we're going to take these gaskets off and replace them with new O-rings. Now, if you have a little bit, you can put some oil around these rings just to help them slide in a little bit easier, and then we'll go ahead and push it in. And then we've got our coolant lines. All right, and then the last thing is to install the wastegate. Slide this through. And then clip it onto here. Just make sure it's all the way on there so that can't come off. And then we'll put these 4 screws back in. All right, and now it's ready to go back into the car. Now, before we get this installed, I did just want to show you guys some of those details of what I was talking about. So just what I've noticed, especially like the outside on cylinders 2 and 5, you can see it's much beefier and bigger at the joints to help it flow a little better. It doesn't like neck down as much as it gets down to that point. So those runners are a little bit bigger. Also, if you look at the exhaust side, you can see it is much more substantial on the Dynamic AutoWorks turbo. So that bigger housing should allow more exhaust flow, which should help improve spool, and it should support, of course, higher horsepower and the higher RPM. And then main thing you guys are probably looking for, so if you see the wheel on here, the stock one is really small. Flowmax is barely able to fit inside the housing, so yeah, that should support a lot more. And then on the intake side, I'm not taking this apart to actually measure the wheel, but here's what the wheel looks like compared to wimpy, hefty.
Now here I put on the silicone coupler on the turbo first, but that ended up being a bad idea, so I take it off later. Just ignore that it's on here for now, but I did want to mention that I like how it comes with a new turbo inlet. Before you had to reuse the stock one, and this one definitely fits better. It also avoids the issue where people forgot to remove the gasket on the inside of the inlet because the turbo would suck it in and that could cause issues. So nice little upgrade with these newer Flowmaxes. But everything out of the way, now we're ready to reinstall the new turbo.
So installation is just the reverse of removal. Basically, you're going to slide the turbo into these little slots
under each runner, and then you reattach the nuts to screw the top in place. So it kind of wedges down and then flips up, and then you secure all the nuts, and that will hold it in place. And don't forget to align that bottom little tab on the turbo with this bracket, and that screw will also hold it up as well. So the first step is to remove the old gasket and replace it with a new one. As someone has chased down exhaust leaks in the past, I know how annoying they can be, so I highly recommend just replacing it now, even if it looks like the old one is in good condition. There's a little alignment pin on each end that fits into a hole on the gasket, so just make sure that those are lined up and then place the gasket in the right position. Then you can go ahead and mount the turbo. Again, you don't have to have the silicone coupler on here, but I do recommend having all the oil and coolant lines installed on the turbo. Just make sure they don't snag on anything when you go to install them, because they could get damaged. This is also the point where some people prefer to have the turbo mounting bracket removed, because it can be hard to line up the ear on the turbo manifold with the slot on the bracket. So yeah, just take your time, get everything lined up in place. Then at this point, you want to go ahead and tighten and torque all of the turbo manifold nuts. This has a specific torquing sequence, so you need to start in the middle and then work your way outwards in a pattern. Keep in mind the torque specs indicate that you need to torque the nuts 5 times. And shout out to Jordan over at RK Tunes for walking me through this, because it was kind of confusing at first. But because we have this layered gasket, it's going to compress and relax as you tighten it down. So when you hit the torque in the first spec, don't just go back and retorque everything again. Give it a little bit of time to settle, and then go back and torque it again and again until you hit your final torque spec. Do this a few times, and what I like to do is start working on the downpipe and remounting the exhaust while I'm letting it relax. Then I come back and do a couple more runs of hitting the final torque. So that'll just make sure that it stays tight and things don't loosen as the gasket relaxes. Now we need to swap some pieces onto the inlet. Mainly you need to move the PCV hose over. This is pretty easy. Just pushing the tabs with a screwdriver on either side and then pull out the hose. On the evap side, since I have the evap delete, I also need to transfer my plug over to keep it sealed up. Since it's an intake, it only sees vacuum, so it doesn't need anything crazy to like hold boost or anything like that. Now we're ready to install the charge pipe, so just push the clip back on, and then it should slide onto the turbo outlet just like the stock turbo. You'll hear a loud click noise as it snaps into place, so push it hard until it's actually fully seated. Then up top, again, we've got those T30 screws, so tighten those down and plug back in your boost sensor and your temp sensor. Now here again, you see me installing the silicone coupler because I couldn't figure out the best order, but what I decided is that you want to install the coupler on the turbo inlet first, then slide the whole thing onto the turbo. So this will give you the clearance that you need to install the charge pipe and everything else with the inlet on. I just found that it was harder with the silicone already on the turbo. I couldn't fit the turbo inlet on there because it's a little bigger than it was before. And with the charge pipe in place, it was just, a little bit too cramped. So do whatever works for you. That's what works for me. Then here you can see I've reinstalled the turbo heat shield from Bimmer Network. A lot of you asked if it will fit the hybrid, and this was specifically something that they made sure it worked with, and they compensated for hybrids when they were designing it. So I had no issues getting it mounted. Everything routed without any interference. The O2 sensors and all of that worked as well. So absolutely no problem there. And then once you've got that on, of course, you just reassemble your intake. Now, lastly, you want to take a couple precautions during your first startup. First thing, of course, is you need to refill your coolant system. I know this clip is showing the wrong reservoir, but I had to drain both systems due to doing some other work at the same time as the turbo replacement. So that's why I'm filling up the low temp coolant circuit. But either way, it's the same process. I'm going to be vacuum filling this time, and I will make a video about that in the future to show you guys how to vacuum fill the system. But this is just an easier way so that you can avoid having to do so many rounds of bleeding to get the system fully filled up. And then, of course, go ahead and make sure you bleed the system so that your cooling system is ready. Next, we're going to move over to the oil. So if you lost excessive oil while pulling the turbo, go ahead and add a little bit. It won't hurt. Of course, we can check oil levels once we've started the car and driven around, but you probably don't want to wait until that point to find out that your oil is low. So feel free to top it off just to make sure that it's not low. And then we also want to make sure that we prime the turbo. And there are a couple different ways to do this. Basically, you want to disable your fuel system so that the engine won't start. And then when you hit the start button, the engine will just crank and turn over. And that will drive the mechanical oil pump so that you can push oil to the turbo and lubricate it. What I don't do is any special additives or anything like that, because personally I don't want to have to worry about trying to flush them out later, or doing your next oil change quickly so it's not just floating in there. Again, do whatever works for you. Whatever your tried and true method is perfectly fine. This is just my strategy. So there are a couple different ways to disable the fuel system. You can unplug all of the injectors so that they won't open and inject any fuel, or you can unplug the number 6 connector on the DME, and that will make sure that your ignition system, your fuel system, basically everything on that harness does not get power. So that's what I opted for this time. I just disconnected the DME connector, and then I went into the car and just tried to turn it over a few times. Again, that just lubricates the turbo. Then we can plug it back in, and when you start your car, everything should be good to go. Just remember, again, you've just replaced a bunch of gaskets, and oils from your hands and stuff are probably on everything. So the car will probably smoke a little bit. That's normal. Just let it happen. Don't freak out. After a couple drives, the smoke should go away. But yeah, at this point, just go for a test drive, check your work, make sure there aren't any boost leaks or anything. Go ahead and reach out to your tuner, make sure you've got a base map ready to go. And that's when it's time to start dialing everything in. You know, I will be making future videos to show you guys the tuning process and the results that I get on my car, tuning it on pump gas, tuning it on ethanol, all that good stuff. So stick around for more videos to follow up and show you guys how this goes. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it for this video. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below.